Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing Chapter 23 from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. And I refer to this particular time period as many scholars actually have begun to do in recent years as the Age of Anxiety. Okay, and the reason that it's called this is because we're now entering into the period just immediately after World War I has ended. Okay, and American society is in the midst of a gigantic upheaval. Okay, and this is something that has had rippling effects throughout the world. But America is a unique feature at this point in time because in the aftermath of the First World War, most other countries in the world, especially in Europe, are going through a period of intense famine and a lot of political upheaval, a lot of lawlessness, lots of nation building, and so forth. And America is the only country that has been involved in the war that has been geographically isolated and has received a large economic windfall from its initial attempts at being neutral in the First World War. So we gained tons and tons of money in profit off of the war. Obviously, we've spent a lot of lives in the war as well, and many of the soldiers who have been away at war are now coming back to American society, and we now have this entirely new dynamic of the way people are approaching American life now. Okay, we've gone into consumerism. We are, in the midst of a lot of new social movements, right? Recognizing certain things about the human condition. So it's a very unique time period, and it doesn't last very long. Okay, this is again the period that's known as the Roaring Twenties to a lot of people, right? It's a period of economic prosperity in the United States, period of a lot of excess, but again, it doesn't last incredibly long because we're gradually approaching the Great Depression, and it's an inevitable thing that gets kind of exacerbated by the fact that we enter into this period of excess for so long. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about all that here. For one thing, once we start to see the end of World War I and all of the domestic issues that are going on in the United States, things are changing quite a bit. Okay, we've had an entire population shift in the United States with the Great Migration. Right, a lot of African Americans are moving from the South into the North. The demographics of northern cities are changing. And now that the soldiers are beginning to return home, we've already discussed a little bit in the previous chapter about a lot of the racial violence that occurs. A lot of riots end up happening, and there's just a lot of pushback. Right, society has essentially progressed in the year or two that the soldiers have been away, and when they return, they're not willing to progress along with it. Okay, a lot of them have intense pushback on that regard. And not only against African Americans, but also against women, right? The women who have been taking over so many of the jobs that a lot of these soldiers have left behind, again, they return back to the fact that they may not have work to come back to, okay? In some cases, their families have had to move on and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of adjustment that has to take place here. And not only that, but we also have a lot of political struggles going on in the United States. Okay, America is now very familiar with what has happened in Russia with the Communist Revolution. So there's a lot of hysteria that's growing in the U.S. About communism. This is what ends up leading us into garnering this anti-communist stance immediately into World War II, and especially thereafter into the Cold War as well. And of course, things like anarchy is still a problem as well. Okay, we enter into a long period where there is, certain instances of domestic terrorism. Right, we have certain bombings that start to occur. There are race riots, there's strikes going on, and so society is starting to become kind of tinged with its experiences now. Okay, all these experiences that people have had in world politics are starting to impact the way that we view life in the United States. And again, there's a bigger divide now between this more conservative, backwards-driven way of life, traditionalism and so forth, versus the new ways of life, right? The way that society has gradually begun to progress in the 1920s with all the social revolutions that are beginning to occur, and all that. So society is very, very torn about all this. And in this particular chapter, we'll look more at the new waves of culture that happen in America. And in the next chapter or two, we'll start to see kind of how all that ends up backfiring a little bit. For one thing, America is now turning into the largest consumer society anywhere in the world. Okay, again, most of the time in the 19th century, when we get into industrialization, it's usually done for a much more functional purpose. Okay, we're actually creating steel, we're creating railroads, we're creating oil, and all this kind of stuff that is used on a very basic level for multiple things. Okay, we're producing materials rather than specific items that we want to market to people. But once we get into the 20th century, things start to really get more specific when it comes to actual consumer products. Okay, so we actually start to open up new markets, niche markets that are geared toward domestic life, toward recreation, toward all these different areas of social life in the United States. And of course, with the beginning of World War I, we see the complete destruction of progressivism altogether. Okay, and part of that is due to the fact, again, that most of the funding that would have gone toward progressive social reforms during the later part of the 1910s and into the 1920s has been rerouted to serve the war effort. And in the aftermath of the war itself, now that we are entering into a period of economic prosperity, where the floor of living is beginning to rise more in the United States. People are starting to be able to afford more things, by and large. Okay, this is not obviously this doesn't affect everybody on equal level, right? The working class still has to struggle quite a bit. But the middle class in particular starts to kind of broaden its horizons a bit, and it can actually afford more commodities and that sort of thing. So the mission of progressivism is kind of lost in the aftermath of a lot of this. And again, there's this new wave of all these different social revolutions that are occurring. Right, we have a sexual revolution, we have the Jazz Age, we have the Harlem Renaissance, we have the advent of film and radio and all this kind of stuff. So all these new social movements are starting to gain more social attention than anything else. Okay, and the backwards movement that is kind of tugging in the opposite direction is this clinginess to conformity, to religious principles and so forth. And especially once we get into the next chapter or two, we'll really start to see how that all begins to all kinds of comes to bear. Okay, when we start to see the pushback of religious fundamentalists and traditionalists, and in some cases it goes into a very, very extreme direction. Okay, so we'll start to see all that here pretty soon. And again, the other new key term that we can start to apply to this time period is modernism. Okay, and modernism is now, again, in the modern sense, what we're talking about here is the aftermath of a world-changing war, right? It's completely redrawn the map of Europe. It's shifted the power center of the world onto the United States. And so we're starting to view ourselves as kind of becoming the pinnacle of what American civilization could be, at least up until this point. Okay, so a lot of people still think from this point America has a long way to go, and certainly it does. But in terms of its economic prosperity and all these kinds of things, we're riding at the highest point we've ever been. Okay, we are the world power at this point. And so all kinds of other ways that this post-war movement is beginning to affect the psychology of people, the sociology, the social makeup of the United States. People are beginning to explore the inner reaches of the human mind and kind of how it ends up affecting creativity and those kinds of things. So art, in particular, is no longer this romantic, idyllic vision of things anymore, right? We don't necessarily have Greek gods and cherubs and that sort of thing, not even religious iconography so much anymore. Now art is becoming considered decadent, right? People are starting to look at the damage done by World War I. Okay, people are beginning to look at ways that they can distort the human shape, ways that they can express emotions in an abstract way, and it ends up becoming off-putting for a lot of people. Okay, and even in today's society, not modern art, quote unquote, is not for everybody. Right? Not everybody enjoys it in the same way as everybody else does. And sexual liberation becomes a really big thing as well. We're now moving away from the overt traditionalism of the past. So people are not so concerned about keeping up with these more puritanistic modesty standards anymore, right? Clothing is changing in the United States. People are beginning to actually acknowledge that humans are sexual creatures. Sigmund Freud is beginning to explore psychoanalysis. So all of this starts to really come to the forefront, and people are beginning to pay a little bit more attention to things that they've suppressed for quite a long time. In 1920, the population is roughly 106 million people, okay? And over half of them are under the age of 25. Okay, so this is another reason why we begin to move more into consumerism, into the emergence of a mass culture of sorts, because now the United States is really not necessarily younger than it's ever been, but this younger society is willing to push the limits further than their conservative predecessors are. Okay, so again, society is beginning to change overwhelmingly. The average lifespan in the United States at this point, too, still hasn't quite reached the age of 60 yet. Okay, so for men, it's roughly 56. For women, it's a little bit older, about 58. And the demographics of the United States is another interesting point, and this is in part due to the way that the census begins to track ethnicity in the United States. And that changes after we get through the 1920s, and really doesn't actually begin to take on a more modern form until the 1930s. So the numbers here might be a little bit staggering. According to the census in the 1920s, 90% of the United States is white. Okay? And the reason for that is because the U.S. Census doesn't begin to actually differentiate between white Americans and Hispanic Americans or Italian Americans or Americans who have European descent who are have a slightly darker complexion, perhaps. Okay, and again, this is part of a larger study that's actually going on currently here in the United States, and something that stretches all the way back into the 19th century. And again, there's an entire book written about this called Working Toward Whiteness, in which if you can quote-unquote pass as white, okay, then you are automatically lumped in with the white category. So if you have a light enough skin complexion, if you have certain facial features that are indicative of European ancestry or something like that, it lends to, again, this sense of quote-unquote passing as white. And again, these types of standards end up with tons and tons of blowback, especially once we get into the 1930s and the way Germany starts to look at ethnicity and all those kinds of things. So the standards of the time are nowhere near ideal in terms of the way society should function, and obviously America has learned quite a bit about this since then. But at this point in time, the line is still very, very blurred. Okay, so we still haven't quite gotten into the differentiation of all that yet. Approximately 9% of America is considered black, and again, this is another instance where if you are of mixed ethnicity, mixed ancestry in this case, again, the more you can pass, quote unquote, for white, the more chance you have of being lumped in with the white category. So even if you are an African American who has a white father and a black mother, or vice versa, depending on your complexion, your facial features, and so forth, you might be lumped into one category or the other. And the U.S. Census at this point, it's worth noting as well, is very, very limited in terms of its effectiveness. Okay, from one year to the next, each census taker might look at a person and have very different standards in their head about how they should, quote unquote, classify a person. Okay, and again, classifying people in general is something that we obviously learn a lot from in the course of all this. Most of it in a very rough way, right? Especially after we get into World War II. But these numbers are not perfect, is my point. Approximately 1% of the United States is considered Native American or Asian. Okay, and those two are lumped together as indigenous peoples. Okay, so Asian in this case, again, clumps all the people from Southeast Asia, as well as people who are Native Hawaiian Islanders, Samoan Islanders, and so forth. So this is people aren't really differentiating in this case either. And over half of the population of the United States is actually living in cities as well. Okay, and cities are considered to be it's a very different standard for that as well because the population is so low. Okay, the town with more than 2,500 residents living in it is considered a city. Okay, in today's world, a city is somewhere in the neighborhood of I don't know, maybe 10,000 people and up, give or take. Right, so it all depends on your personal standards in some cases, but that number has changed, and all these numbers have obviously changed for different reasons. The wealth of the United States, of course, also has nearly doubled between 1920 and 1930. All right, we already have this large economic windfall from a lot of the money that we've made during the First World War. And people are beginning to invest this money in certain companies. They're beginning to start new businesses. And again, the American economy is just gradually expanding exponentially in the midst of all this. We also enter into a post-war building boom as well, right? We start to have all these new types of construction equipment that are coming out. We obviously have had electric motors for a few decades at this point. But we also now have construction equipment, right? It's no longer something that's done by hand with a horse and cart. Now we actually have tractors and bulldozers, steam shovels, new ways of constructing buildings and so forth and demolishing them to actually make things bigger and potentially more efficient than ever before. In 1920, there's approximately 5,000 electric refrigerators produced, and by 1929, it's over 1 million being produced. Okay, so the refrigerator you see here on the right was actually produced, I think, in 1927. So this was the standard refrigerator you would see in typical people's homes, and it's not very big. I mean, this is about the size of a miniature refrigerator, like you would see in I don't know, a dorm room or something today. And ironically, the year that the stock market eventually does crash in 1929, the United States has the highest standard of living anywhere in the world. Okay, and this is pretty evident because of the aftermath of the First World War. Okay, everybody else in Europe is very heavily struggling. Okay, the economies have been destroyed. All the funds from a lot of these countries that would have gone toward actually feeding people were put toward the war effort and building machinery and weapons and so forth. And now that the land itself in many cases has been decimated, it's difficult for people to even grow anything again. Okay, so again, we enter into that period where we've kicked the ant mound, metaphorically speaking, and now the ants are scattering everywhere. People are not living a very stable life everywhere else. But the United States, again, has been untouched, physically speaking, by the war itself. And again, in the 1920s, this is when we really begin to shift into production of consumer products, right? Things that people recognize. We enter into using advertising like what you see in the background here. This is one for Lucky Strike cigarettes, okay? You get catchphrases like "it's toasted," like you see here. And ironically, I mean, when you look at these kinds of advertisements today, they're incredibly inaccurate for the way medicine has begun to look at things, and this is another reason why medicine has suffered a lot during this time period. But the picture you see here in the background is actually a doctor, obviously a painting of a doctor or something here, but it says that the doctor is recommending Lucky Strike because it's, quote, less irritating to a person's throat. Okay, so again, and they even give a statistic here, right? 20,000, I think 679 physicians recommend Lucky Strikes to be less irritating to the throat. Okay, and it's less irritation against the cough that you might get and so forth. So, people begin to recognize products like this because they have logos, they have catchphrases. Coca-Cola, like you see up here at the top right, begins to be more and more popular as well. And people are making very extravagant purchases now. They actually have the money to do it, or they're doing it on credit. Okay, and credit becomes a brand new feature of all this, and it's part of the reason why we end up getting into the Great Depression in the first place. People are borrowing more than their means have to pay things back. The process of layaway is something else that begins during this period, and some stores still offer layaway today. I don't think it's really so much a thing anymore in the 21st century. But again, it's like something on credit, right? You set it aside, you make installment plans on it, and then you are able to eventually bring it home with you. And by 1921, staggering number is that nearly 60% of Americans are on some kind of an installment plan for something. Whether it's a refrigerator, an automobile, a vacuum cleaner, furniture, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so a lot of Americans are getting very heavily into debt. And again, this is a lot of foreshadowing for what we are going to end up experiencing when the stock market bottoms out. And women are also one of the largest targets in a lot of these advertisements during this period because they're purchasing 2/3 of all consumer goods. And it's no surprise that if you look at some of the ads from the 1920s, most of the ones that deal with consumer products like clothing irons, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, anything that is used in a domestic setting, most of the time they're geared toward women, or they have women in the advertisements themselves. Okay, so you know the understanding of the advertisers at the time, again, is that women are still in this cult of domesticity, right? This domestic environment, and they're using whatever money their husbands bring home to purchase all the goods for the house. Okay, so again, it's still, in hindsight, it seems sexist, but at the time period, that was still the standard. And in 1920, it's estimated only 35% of homes are electrified. Okay, so and again, especially in places like the South, electricity and running water don't even become a reality in some instances all the way up until the 1960s. Okay, so this is a long way off for some people, especially in the poorest areas. Okay, but in the northern part of the country, especially, and in some places out west, that's really where this happens most. But by 1930, 68% are electrified. Okay, so it grows exponentially, again, because so many consumer products rely on electricity now. And you get all kinds of individualized things here. Flush toilets, for one thing. You see the advertisement here. And yes, ironically enough, as humorous as it sounds, one particular manufacturer was Thomas Crapper. Yes. He didn't invent the flush toilet, but he was one of the primary manufacturers of flush toilets that could be installed in homes now that there is indoor plumbing. And of course, indoor toilets have this chain. Here you see the toilet tank is near the ceiling. You would actually pull the chain here to flush the toilet. Electric irons, electric fans could be installed in homes. You see handheld cameras like this one here, right? It's got kind of this accordion thing that ends up folding out. Wristwatches are now becoming a popular thing, right? We're moving away from pocket watches. We're actually wearing them on our wrists more than anything. Cigarette lighters, vacuum cleaners are another strange thing, especially during this time period. Down here at the bottom right, this looks more like a tea trolley or a coffee trolley or something like that. It would be this larger, almost like the size of a desk, or like a washing machine, even in today's standards. And you would actually hook up a hose to this little cylindrical tank here on the left side, and then flip the switch, and it would suck everything into this little tank. But it requires so much more to work the motor itself. Okay, so vacuum cleaners were not exactly something you could shove into a coat closet at the end of the day, right? They were too large. And also, we start to use different products and different materials to put on our floors, right? We use linoleum, for instance, and linoleum at the time was a very fancy thing to have. But if you get a house now that was built in the 1920s that has linoleum, most of the time people want to tear it up because it's in most people's eyes it tends to look a little tacky today. And of course, now we're entering into the period where film and radio become incredibly popular as well. The first film that was ever actually shown in the United States was shown in 1896, and it's called The Kiss. Okay, and it's only 18 seconds long. I believe it was actually Edison who filmed this, and it's just a kiss between two people. That's really all it happens to be. By 1924, though, we have 20,000 theaters in the United States showing 700 new silent films every single year. Okay, and these silent films are not incredibly long, right? They may only be, anywhere from 10 or 15 minutes to half an hour. We haven't quite gotten all the way up to a feature-length film just yet. Okay, this is still kind of on the cusp of some of that. Okay, so sometimes we would have a film that might be an hour. A longer film would be the standard hour and a half, as it is today. And 80 million people during every single week in the 1920s go see a film. Okay, so this is more than it's nearly the entire population of the United States. Okay, 106 million people, 80 million of those people are going to see the film, going to the movies every single week. 1927 is the year that the quote-unquote talkies are released, okay? And so this is when we finally are able to add audio to films, okay? Instead of having just a silent mouth moving and then the caption showing up on the screen, now we can actually have both at the same time, and it's a more realistic experience. And by 1930, the population of the United States has grown to about 123 million people. 115 million of those people are going weekly to the cinema. Okay, and again, this is considered the golden age of film, right? The 1930s and 1940s. People are beginning to churn out films on such a regular basis. This is when the first Hollywood stars become popular. When the first major films that we celebrate so much in the United States become popular. And it's estimated 10 times as many people in the United States are spending money on movie tickets as they are on sports tickets. Okay, so and it's easier, obviously, because sports happen outdoors, they're subject to the weather and so forth. And films, you can go inside in a dark theater and watch it. One of the most famous silent film actors of the time period, of course, is Charlie Chaplin. Okay, and Chaplin has got a very long and complicated history as a film star and also as a director as well. When we get into the 1920s, we'll see that he actually falls victim, or not the 20s, I beg your pardon, the 1950s. He actually falls victim to the Red Scare movement, where people begin to identify potential communists working in the United States in the film industry in particular. And he actually ends up leaving the United States altogether because his reputation is destroyed. But his most iconic character is what you see here, the character known as the tramp. Right? And in this case, a tramp is not necessarily a pejorative term for a woman or anything like that. This is actually a term for someone who is a homeless individual or someone who is a traveler without a home is essentially what we have. And of course, he's known for the little toothbrush mustache, right? The long cane and the floppy shoes here. Okay, so and he immortalized this character, right? He used this character as a serial character in several different films, and so we have a recurring character with his own kind of non-consecutive film series. And of course, with film, we start to see the exact same thing that we see here 100 years later. Okay? Film begins to dictate fashion. It begins to dictate music, hairstyles, social values. Mass culture in general begins to dictate the way that the younger generation views themselves and views the rest of the world, okay, for better or for worse. And of course, just like we had 100 years ago, and just like we have today, the older generation is not necessarily approving of this, right? They don't necessarily adopt the same level of standards as the younger generation does. Okay, and so this is not a new thing necessarily, right? Older generations tend to be more conservative in terms of pushing the envelope relative to wherever they fall on the general timeline of the United States. So it's all relative. The character you see here in the background hanging off the clock is Buster Keaton. He's another very famous silent film star, kind of along the same vein as Charlie Chaplin. Okay, he operates as kind of the slapstick comedy and so forth. And the image that you see here of him actually hanging off the clock in this particular film of his served as partial inspiration for Christopher Lloyd, Doc Brown, hanging off the clock in Back to the Future. 1920, WWJ in Detroit starts broadcasting news bulletins. Okay, so we actually have news radio stations beginning to broadcast all over the United States. And KDKA in Pittsburgh actually has regularly scheduled programs now. So we're not only are we doing the news, now we actually start to incorporate serials into all this, actual series that are occurring with dramatized productions of characters like the Shadow, Little Orphan Annie, right? All these different characters that can be recognized in these dramatized audio serials. And in some cases, you can still find them today, even on YouTube. You can go out there and actually listen to some of these old broadcasts. In 1922, the first radio commercial airs in New York, okay, and by the end of the year, there are 508 stations in the United States broadcasting radio commercials, radio broadcasts, news bulletins, sports, you name it. 1926 is when the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, begins linking stations together and creates a national network, right? So in other words, we don't have individual radio stations in each city. Now we actually have a nationwide broadcasting. And this is a little out of order here, but the Grand Ole Opry also begins operating in 1925. Okay, so if you're a fan of country music, right, this was the kind of the beginning of broadcasting those types of things all over the U.S. as well. And in 1927, the Columbia Broadcasting Company begins to follow NBC. Okay, this is CBS. And they start doing the same thing. They just become a competitive company. Quite possibly the most prominent feature of the 1920s in terms of the way society has begun to change and quote-unquote modernize is the introduction of machines in our everyday lives. And up until this point, again, machinery has only been used for industrial purposes or has been used for wartime purposes. But again, anytime we enter into a large conflict of some kind, right, a world war or something along those lines, whatever technology is typically used during wartime ends up filtering down into consumer society not too long after the conflict ends. Okay, and this is no exception. Before any of the wars actually ever begin, okay, in 1903, we get the introduction of Wilbur and Orville Wright in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And these two gentlemen actually create the first sustainable flying machine, okay, the first airplane. And it's kind of staggering because the quick succession of what we have in the United States, the dramatic influx of machinery, the dramatic progress of machinery from this simple, very humble, maybe 20 or 30 second sustained flight of this little biplane that these gentlemen create, all the way up until 1914. Only 11 years later, we have motorized airplanes that are being used as reconnaissance weapons in the First World War. Okay, so this is a dramatic change. And man has only been able to get up in the air in an aircraft of some kind only since 1783. Okay, 1783 is the year that the Montgolfier brothers invent the hot air balloon. Okay, and hot air balloons were used in some regards, like during the Civil War and so forth as well. But to have a sustained airplane flight that can have human beings in it and that can be piloted, that can actually be, sent in a specific direction, that can turn and so forth. All of this is incredibly innovative. By 1925, airplanes have become so prevalent, not only in use during wartime, but also in consumer culture in the United States, that the U.S. government passes what's called the Kelly Act. Okay, and the federal government begins to subsidize the aircraft industry for itself. Okay, and we actually begin to incorporate things like the FAA, right, the Federal Aviation Administration. Okay, so to actually monitor airplane flights in the United States, to commercialize it, and not just to use it for military, but also for simple travel purposes. And the Air Commerce Act follows a year later, and this is what provides federal funds to creating and fostering air transportation, to set up navigational towers, to construct airports in the United States. So only within a span of 23 years have we gone from a 30-second flight of two guys in an aircraft to full-fledged passenger vehicles. So it's a staggering level of progress that the U.S. is able to accomplish. A year later, Charles Lindbergh becomes the first man to fly a solo nonstop transatlantic flight, okay, in the Spirit of St. Louis. And the Spirit of St. Louis is the little silver plane that you see up here at the top right. Lindbergh becomes a figure with a lot of public drama attached to him, especially once we get further into the 1920s and into the 30s as well. We'll see him pop up again a time or two. And of course, Amelia Earhart is another very famous individual from the time. She's the first woman to actually accomplish a solo transatlantic flight herself. And the reason Amelia Earhart is known to most people is the fact that she disappeared on her last transatlantic flight. Her plane never landed where it was supposed to land, and there have been all kinds of separate theories as to what could potentially have happened. Even in recent years, within the past decade, there have been expeditions in the South Pacific to determine whether or not her plane crash-landed in the ocean, if she landed on an island and lived out the rest of her days there. But no definitive proof, as far as I'm aware, has been given to determine exactly what happened to her. And the first motor car, nicknamed a horseless carriage, is manufactured in 1895. Okay, so we're talking about ground transportation now. And you see it up here, right? It looks like a gigantic tricycle of some kind. Okay, and you see the motor back here behind it operates with a belt on it, just kind of like a modern motor would in a car. And a person would sit up here. You'd have a little handbrake here, this little lever sticking out of the seat. And you would be able to turn on the gas and the brakes depending on how you controlled this particular little lever. Okay, so it's becomes a little bit difficult to steer. Okay, you have a little handle here on the side on this little tall pole here where you would turn it back and forth. By 1903, though, Henry Ford is the one who actually establishes the new standard of mass production of automobiles using an assembly line, okay, and using standardized parts for an automobile where each stage of the process has an individual putting in a specific piece. It's estimated that one full car is built every 93 minutes using Henry Ford's assembly line. Okay, so this is a brand new way of actually pushing out mass production of new commodities, and especially in the sense of automobiles, right? A gigantic machine with several moving parts can be manufactured that quickly. And the first particular model that Henry Ford comes out with is the Model T. Okay, the Model T comes out in 1908, and you see it here. And at the time, it was worth about $850, okay, which adjusted for inflation is usually, given about the standard price of an automobile today, about $22,000. Okay. By 1924, it goes down even more to only $290. Okay, and the reason for that is because now that we have actually begun to perfect this new way of actually building cars, we have standardized parts and so forth. It's cheaper to do that. Okay, and obviously this would be less than a $4,000 car today, right? It's difficult in some cases to buy a used car for that amount. And by 1920, we enter into a period where there are 8 million registered vehicles in the United States. Okay, this is, again, still quite a large number, even considering that there's over 100 million people living in the U.S. By 1929, though, there are 23 million in the U.S., okay? And the United States at this point in time is still the primary producer of gasoline in the world. Okay, our oil reserves are still holding out relatively well. Okay, so we're producing about 2/3 of the world's gasoline at this point. Not until we get to the 1930s and especially into World War II do we begin to actually look elsewhere. Okay, and especially the British begin to look at the Middle East around that time period. This is when we begin to engage with Persia, which is modern-day Iran, for oil reserves. Spectator Sports, again, is another big feature of the 1920s. Okay, for the people who can't get out to go to the movies or something, if they're stuck at home working, or if they're working in a factory or something, somebody might have a transistor radio nearby. Okay, you can turn on a radio station, you can listen to the ball game. Okay, and America begins to nickname baseball as the national pastime in the 1920s. Okay, this is where we have home teams competing against other teams. You have national rivalries, and all these newsworthy things that begin to happen. You have very famous figures like George Herman Ruth, a.k.a. Babe Ruth. Okay, Babe Ruth becomes very famous for being a pitcher first, and then once he begins to hit home runs with an amount of force that he does, okay, he becomes famous for having one of the highest home run records in baseball history. Right, it's only surpassed in a few decades later. By 1920, there's over 1 million spectators at Babe Ruth's games on a regular basis. Okay, he becomes kind of this national hero. A lot of kids start to look up to him, and in part because Babe Ruth himself was actually an orphan. Okay, he came from the working class, right? He actually had kind of this uncouth attitude, right? He smoked, he drank, he swore on a regular basis. And so he's kind of a hero for the working class in the United States, right? And especially among kids who are, having a difficult upbringing, or if they come up as orphans themselves, right? They have a hero to look up to, right? Someone who is literally a rags to riches story. And because of Babe Ruth and because of several of his teammates, right, the New York Yankees begin to win World Series championships, 1923, 27, and 28. And another one of Babe Ruth's teammates is Lou Gehrig. Right, Lou Gehrig is another very, very famous baseball player for his batting average, and later on in life also for the fact that he develops a debilitating neurological disease that we now call Lou Gehrig's disease. Okay, ends up preventing people from being able to walk, and eventually it does claim Lou Gehrig's life in 1941. And baseball, unfortunately, like a lot of things in the United States at this point, is still considered a segregated event. Okay, so this leads to the creation of the so-called Negro Leagues in the 1920s, and we start to see, a separation of the two groups. There is a Negro circuit where people can actually begin to move teams from one city to the next to play in segregated stadiums and so forth. And eventually, of course, we enter into a period in time where that ends up breaking down. Of course, once we get into the 1940s, 1950s, gradually it starts to go away. And football begins to actually take on a little bit more precedence during this period as well, especially at the college level. Okay, at the national level, it hasn't quite got the same following as baseball does. Red Grange, aka Harold Edward Grange, is the first athlete to actually appear on the cover of Time magazine. He's a football player. And of course, you see here how much the football uniform has changed. Okay, the padded helmet and padded uniform has been replaced by everything that we know today, a really heavy fiberglass helmet and all this kind of stuff, and protection and so forth, because the game has become a little bit more violent in recent decades. And boxing is another one that becomes very popular. If you ever see the film Cinderella Man, or if you're ever familiar with any of the fights that took place during this time period, individuals like Jack Dempsey became the world heavyweight champion in 1919, eventually loses it in 1927. But boxing especially, and prize fighting in general, are very, very popular with the working class in particular. Any kind of contact sport or blood sport tends to be very popular with that particular contingency. And especially in the 1920s leading into the Great Depression, right, this is one of the only events where people have something to look up to, especially once the economy begins to tank, people begin to lose their jobs. It becomes something to rally around. And Jack Dempsey's fights have over 100,000 attendees, okay, and 60 million people are listening to him fight on the radio as well. Okay, so this is a very, very popular sport. And again, something where people begin to look at athletes as local, if not national, heroes. The other thing as well that begins to change is new generations begin to rebel against societal standards. Okay? And this is not necessarily a new feature for this time period, but it does become more prevalent beginning in the 1920s. And it's usually college students who are getting involved in a lot of this as well. Okay? There's a lot of social rebellion, a lot of cultural rebellion against the old standards, again, of religion, of social taboos, and so forth. And the novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald is the one who actually coins the term the jazz age for the 1920s. Okay, he writes a book called This Side of Paradise in 1920, becomes a bestseller, rockets him up to popularity. Of course, later on he writes The Great Gatsby. And he's called the voice of his generation because he recognizes and understands this level of rebellion in American culture, right? This fact that we, now that we've gotten past this dramatic and world-changing event with the First World War, we've hit kind of a climax with American culture, right? There is no going back after this. And so again, he uses the term jazz age to refer to everything that's going on here. And jazz music in general becomes incredibly controversial during this time period. And there is a lot of, best way I can put it really is that there's a lot of racist tendencies with the way that white America views jazz during this period. And in modern times, jazz is considered pretty innocuous, right? It's usually instrumental. It's based in improvisation, uses all kinds of classical instruments and so forth, but it doesn't seem like it's that harmful in any real sense. But during this time period, jazz was actually considered a nickname for sexual intercourse. And the entire style of music that jazz is involved with, because it doesn't follow a strict pattern, because it doesn't always have a specific way that it goes, because it's based so much in improvisation, for some reason the older generation began to look at this and say that this is something that's too sexualized, that somehow there's too much looseness in it, that it causes some weird kind of predilection for people to begin to break away from actual standards in living, just like the way this breaks away from standards in music. It's a strange connection that people begin to make. Okay. But jazz is essentially it's an American-based movement, right? It's a combination of ragtime, which is based in piano playing, and the blues, right? Okay, and the blues is another thing that's considered to be a typical American invention, right? The blues end up kind of coming out of, in some cases, out of old spirituals that began to be written during slavery, end up turning into a way of expressing discontent with life in America in general, right? Whether it's, through, your lot in life that you have, through relationships, through whatever. And so jazz is some kind of a new combination of all that, lumped together. And again, there's tons of spontaneity in jazz. There's improvisation, there's variation. It doesn't always follow a specific key, right? You can move from one key to the next in music. Again, several different instruments can invoke several different emotions. So it is very, very emotional. And again, American society, white American society in particular, is not always on board with this. Okay, so it's part of that breakaway from traditionalism that people are so accustomed to seeing. And of course, individuals like Duke Ellington become incredibly popular during this period. You see him here in the background playing his piano as well. Very famous jazz composer and a band leader. And of course, the great Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, right? The most famous trumpet player potentially that America has ever had, right? He's very, very well known for all this. And Louis Armstrong, again, not just as a trumpet player, but also as a singer and a songwriter himself. Okay, so this is the beginning where Black Americans in particular become very, very popular for innovation in music and for the wide reach that they begin to have, right? The popularity that they begin to have in American culture, okay, more so than ever before. And of course, we start to see the movement into the sexual revolution as well, and a lot of that begins with the methods employed by Dr. Sigmund Freud. Okay, and Freud himself, of course, is the one who is responsible for beginning the practice of psychoanalysis. Okay, psychoanalysis is this way of looking at human experience and identifying certain specific events in one's past, one's development from childhood all the way into adulthood, where allegedly what happens here is that you might encounter some sort of trauma, or you might have developed not necessarily incorrectly, but at a staggered rate, to where there's some kind of hiccup in your development that leads you to develop some sort of sexual predilection in one direction or another. Freud tried to use this to explain homosexuality, to try to explain different personality traits in all of society, in women in particular, and in sexual repression, right? To actually say that the reason why we don't want to talk about sex is because of some sort of trauma that we've undergone somewhere along the line. And of course, he comes up with theories like, the Oedipus complex, where you actually have a man who is somehow sexually attracted to his mother. You have the Electra complex, which is the exact opposite, a woman sexually attracted to her father. And of course, as you can imagine, if America is, upset by jazz, they're obviously going to be upset by this kind of thing as well. Okay, this was something that typically just was not discussed. Okay, and Freud himself is Austrian, right? He's not, he's not from America, right? So it's very easy for Americans to look at all the stuff that he has to say and say, well, that's foreign garbage, foreign nonsense, right? Foreign decadence, and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so America is not willingly able to receive a lot of what he has to say, at least initially. And he also claims that essentially the human mind is all based in the unconscious and the subconscious levels of the brain. He says that we have these unconscious efforts to maintain some kind of suppression of our libido. Okay, and the libido is the sexual drive in humans. Okay, so so he says this is why we end up having sexual dreams, why we end up acting things out when it comes to things that we've tried to suppress over the lifetime. He says this is why people develop sexual fetishes and that sort of thing. So very complex and very controversial, and some of which has been debunked, right, since then. Right, we're 100 years into this type of thing, but Freud actually does set a precedent by being willing at least to take a look at a lot of this. And his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, is what really starts to push the idea that the subconscious mind is what ends up shaping our behaviors and shapes our moods. Okay, so Freud says that every wish is a dream, or every dream is a wish, essentially. Okay, so whether that's true or not, it's usually dreams that we have are typically manifestations of things that we experience during the day that have been filtered into our subconscious mind, is really what he ends up saying. And he does a lot of work at the time period with Carl Jung as well. Okay, Jung is the one who looks more specifically at dream interpretation and the creation of different archetypes that people can recognize in myth, in legends, and so forth. Okay, so a lot of deep dives that you see into human psychology during this period. And of course, one of the big things associated specifically with Freud and the image of the psychotherapist or the psychiatrist or whatever is of Freud himself saying, "Lie on my couch and tell me about your childhood." Okay, this is when talk therapy becomes a form of treatment now. Okay, we're still a long way away from getting into any more modernized versions of mental health facilities and help and so forth, but Freud begins to actually take it in the right direction with this. And by 1916, there's 500 psychoanalysts operating in New York City alone. So we actually have new ways of education being geared towards psychology, and again, a lot of Freud's teachings and so forth come into play here, right, with actually training physicians. And at the same time, too, right, it's easy for Americans to begin to focus more on romance and sex in general because a lot of popular magazines in the United States begin to actually transition into looking at these types of things. Okay, many of them are geared toward women, especially at this time period. Right, we see the beginning of magazines like Cosmopolitan and so forth. Which, if you look at a newsstand today, Cosmopolitan magazine and others like it tend to engage in discussions about, sex and that kind of thing, whatever happens in the bedroom. And we haven't really gotten into the advent of quote-unquote men's magazines yet, right? Magazines like Playboy don't come out until the 1950s, but we're moving in that direction as a culture. And of course, film is what ends up dictating so much for this new generation. Okay, Okay, female film stars in particular begin to resonate with a lot of society, both male and female, for representing sexual freedom, for having some kind of vivacious attitude, some kind of energy with life, and a sense of independence as well. So famous stars like Madge Bellamy, Clara Bow, and Joan Crawford all have this appeal both to men and to women, right? Men tend to be attracted to them. Women tend to want to emulate them, their appearance, their attitudes, the characters they play, their fashion sense, and all this kind of stuff. So again, this is really when mass culture begins to very heavily affect the newer generation in particular. And to go along with that, we also have the aspect of birth control, okay? And it's the most controversial, quote-unquote, women's issue during the Jazz Age. Okay? Begins and is typically centered around Margaret Sanger. Okay? Margaret Sanger was a controversial nurse and midwife operating in a working-class tenement neighborhood in New York. And she is the first one to actually advocate for birth control, and again, in a controversial way, because she, like a lot of people at the time in American society, right, being backed up by various forms of science and pseudoscience and developing medicine and so forth, begins to look at this type of thing as being potentially affected by eugenics. Okay? And eugenics is basically looking at the genetic makeup of society and trying to, quote unquote, weed out those who are dissidents or those who don't exactly fit in. Okay, so it's a very harsh way of looking at reality, and it's something that filters in some ways to social Darwinism and things to that nature as well. But she's looking essentially at poor neighborhoods, people who don't have the means to take care of children, people who might be what she believes to be intellectually inferior or not necessarily racially inferior, although that does play into some eugenics arguments during this period in time. But her advocacy for this, right, for a woman's right to choose the way whether or not she should be able to reproduce, causes her to fall afoul of the law. Okay, she is arrested in 1916 for obscenity because she starts distributing a magazine called Woman Rebel. Okay, and it's a magazine that she herself is printing that is supposed to focus specifically on contraception, women's suffrage, and workers' rights. Okay, the last two are still controversial things at this point in time, and women's suffrage, of course, does actually become a reality in 1920, and we get gradual workers' rights movements that happen before and after the period as well. But contraception doesn't really become a reality until the 1960s and 70s in the United States. So this is still moving us in that direction, and she's still ahead of her time for that. And she actually opens the first birth control clinic in New York City after the obscenity charge is dropped. Okay, and the 1920s, again, becomes very controversial with regard to her because she endorses sterilization for those who are considered mentally incompetent, right? So, again, individuals who could potentially be taken advantage of, and those who have certain hereditary conditions, if they have, certain hereditary diseases, or if they have congenital birth defects. Again, very controversial in terms of, whether one would support this or be against it. Again, take from this what you will. This is just stating fact. But by 1922, there is an American Birth Control League that is formed to try to legalize this and to try to actually make it more of a common thing to see in the United States. Okay, and eventually it changes its name to Planned Parenthood. Okay, and so, again, Planned Parenthood still has a lot of pushback, especially among conservative society today. In 1936, though, federal courts do allow physicians to prescribe birth control in certain instances. So if a doctor makes a judgment call and says, yes, I will prescribe this to you for one reason or another, then it can be allowed. But again, it's a judgment call, right? If you get a progressive enough doctor who will allow this to happen, they might prescribe it just based on request. But if it's a conservative doctor, they might ask for more medical reasons. Okay, so again, it's not streamlined by any sense at this point. And women in general begin to change during this time period as well, in appearance, in terms of what freedoms they can enjoy in society, whatever social upward mobility they could potentially have. Okay, and a lot of it again begins to change through fashion, right? Through the visual image of women in magazines, in film, and so forth. 1919, for example, skirts were typically about 6 inches above the ground. That's about as high as they could potentially go. 1927, though, skirts come all the way to the knee. Okay? And again, American society views these types of things as scandalous the closer they get, okay, the higher they get. And the University of Texas, even in 1921, tries to pass a bill that would actually jail a woman with a skirt 3 inches above the ankle. Okay, so, in the more conservative geographical areas of society at this point, people are still not willing to entertain any kind of thoughts like this. Skin-tight bathing suits for women would automatically get a woman jailed for obscenity, okay, in the United States. If a woman has a bathing suit that is potentially above the knee, I think during this point in time, if it's a skirt that's too form-fitting or something like that, they can be given a ticket for public indecency. Right? There's actually photographs you can find where it looks essentially like I don't know how I can put it, like Spanx or something, right? Like some kind of unitard, like you would see in a gymnastics class or something, or in an 80s music video, right? That's what an obscene swimsuit would have looked like back then, right? It still covers much more skin than what we're used to seeing today. And of course, the iconic female fashion movement of the 1920s is the flapper movement, okay? And these are typically young women who have done a complete overhaul in their appearance. They keep up with modern fashion, and they have kind of a negative stereotype attached to them, right? They're typically characterized as young women who are out for pleasure, and they're defying standards that existed before the war. Okay? Those are the two primary features of the flapper movement. And the one who is actually considered the iconic example of this is Zelda Fitzgerald, right, the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Okay, and her husband is the one who actually calls her the first American flapper because she has this really vivacious personality, a really rebellious attitude about gender norms. And flappers are typically depicted as women who smoke, who drink, again, during the period of prohibition, right, when it's illegal to do so. Sometimes they engage in risky sexual behavior, they take illicit drugs, they listen to jazz music, right? It's basically everything that culminates in a conservative American's nightmare of what they believe a woman should be doing. And as you can imagine, with this particular advent, conservatism spikes in the United States, right? People actually begin to push back against this and say, no, not all women in the United States behave this way, right? This is immoral, this is blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there's all kinds of, there's both sides to the argument here, okay? Whether you fall on the progressive side or the conservative side, again, this is just the way that society is divided at this point. And some colleges, and many colleges, most colleges, in fact, try to steer their curriculum based on traditional female roles. So if you are a young woman going to a college, chances are you're going to be pigeonholed into a course about how to be a good wife, how to be a good mother, how to treat the family as an economic unit, right? How to become thrifty with your purchases and all this kind of stuff. Again, it's all geared around this cult of domesticity, okay? Something that doesn't really start to get abandoned so much by women in America until the 1960s, really. Okay, and when second and third wave feminism become more popular and begin to gain traction. Okay, but this is kind of the first wave of a lot of this. And fewer women are trying to go after professional careers at this point too. Okay, now that we've got this economic prosperity, women who are actually getting married or settling down, they're not trying to gain any kind of professional career for themselves, right? And the flapper women are typically the ones who are considered to be kind of hanging on the shoulder of a guy or potentially being funded by someone else. Okay, they don't actually have a job for themselves. And again, it's another reason why conservatives look at this and say that these women are too loose, right? When the money runs out with one person, they move on to the next sugar daddy, right? That kind of thing. And only 4% of women occupy salaried professional positions during the 1920s. Okay, so even the movements that we saw in the latter part of the 19th century with women going into clerical positions and so forth are already on the decline. And there is an increase in beauty shops from the 1920s to the 1930s. It goes from 5,000 all the way up to 40,000 in the United States. Again, because of the physical image of women and in pop culture and so forth, people want to try to emulate that more and more. Okay, so hairstylists, makeup salons, nail salons, you name it, they all start to explode in popularity. And as it relates to relationships in general, most of the time in most corners of the United States, not just in the South, interracial marriage is still considered taboo. Okay, so it's you'd have to live in a very, very progressive part of the United States in order to be able to have this kind of a relationship. And again, all the way up until the 1960s and 70s, and in some cases even well into the modern day, there are still parts of the United States that still push back on this. Okay, so this is still something where, in some cases, it would be considered illegal. And concerning African Americans, the Great Migration that we started to see during the Great War also continues into the 1920s. Again, it's not something that really tapers off or ends with the end of World War I. Right? People are still trying to get away from Jim Crow. They're still trying to get away from all the persecution they experience in the South. And so, again, during the decade between the 1920s and 30s, there's nearly 1 million African Americans that move into northern cities. And again, we already said that it changes the demographics of the cities. By 1900, though, only about 740,000 blacks live outside the South, which is about 8% of the nation's population in general. And by 1970, though, we have 10.6 million people living outside the South, African Americans. This number jumps from 8% to 47% living outside the South. Okay, so this is not something, again, that tapers off or ends. It actually is increasing and sustaining itself all throughout this time period because we have people trying to get away from all these racist laws. And we start to see new precedents being set. Guys like Oscar DePriest, right? Oscar DePriest becomes the first black man elected to Congress since Reconstruction, okay? And he's the first one to be elected in a northern district in Illinois. And once migrating African Americans do get to the north, they do experience a lot of culture shock, okay? And there's still a lot of pushback from factory workers about this. The immigrant population is very high in the north compared to the south. Interacting with other working class members, right, who could be from other nationalities, other cultures, right, just city life in general can alienate a person very quickly. And the NAACP has been in existence since 1910 and begins to more actively advocate for African Americans in the country, right, to help them get better rights as workers, to push for more civil rights. Right, so we're still a long way off from the actual civil rights movement, but we still have a little bit of forward mobility here. And specifically, we're still stuck back in the 14th and 15th Amendments, right? Protecting voting rights, protecting civil rights in the United States, and trying to end things like lynchings and so forth, which are still occurring in the South at this point in time. Okay, so the South is still very much stuck in the past, and it's going to take it a while to get back out of it. One of the most important events that occurs during the 1920s and really spans from the very end of World War I well into the mid part of the 1930s is the Harlem Renaissance. Okay? And Harlem Renaissance is extremely important because this is one of the culminations of the post-Reconstruction and even post-Jim Crow, even though Jim Crow is still technically going on in the South. It's an evolution and a flourishing of black culture in America, specifically centered in Harlem in New York City. Okay. And this is something where you actually have the first major literary and artistic movement centered around black culture in the United States. Okay, it's the first real celebration of it. Again, first of its kind because most of the rest of the country has done quite a bit to suppress black culture in whatever form it happened to take. Okay, whether it was in in mimicry of white culture in early stages, or if it was, through slavery, through oppression, through colonial efforts, whatever it happened to be. This is the first time where this new culture that the black community has built for itself over the course of several generations is finally, again, reaching its culmination and being celebrated in the public atmosphere. Okay. Just to give you an idea of the demographics of the region, in 1890, Harlem was still predominantly quote-unquote white in terms of the sheer number of people who were living in New York City. And remember, this is still before the beginning of the Great Migration, so most northern cities still had a predominantly white population at this point. But once we get into the First World War, the number changes very dramatically. Okay, so in 1890, it's estimated that 1 in 70 Harlem residents were black. Okay, and again, that number might be a little bit skewed by the fact that the U.S. Census wasn't exactly recognizing differences in ethnicity and tended to lump anybody who was not black or Native American or Asian into the white category. Okay, so again, these numbers might be a little bit skewed in that regard. But by 1930, 1 in 9 Harlem residents are black. Okay, so again, as a direct result of the Great Migration, with a lot of African Americans leaving the South, getting away from Jim Crow, from segregation and all that kind of stuff, and settling in New York City, and particularly in Harlem, we enter into an entirely new form of this type of movement that can actually occur in the United States. And again, this is in the aftermath of the first attempts at civil rights movements that we saw post-Reconstruction, again, during the beginning of Jim Crow. And now in the North, where society is a little bit more pluralistic, a little bit more socially tolerant, I guess is probably the nicest way we can put it, this is actually allowed to occur. Okay, it's not suppressed so much, and Harlem becomes one of those neighborhoods that kind of starts to house immigrants from other parts of the United States. Okay, so just like most big cities in the North started to have these little niche neighborhoods specifically for immigrants who were coming from maybe China or parts of Central Europe or Italy or something like that, Harlem becomes a center for a lot of immigrants who come specifically from, and not international immigrants, again, it's national migrants is really what it happens to be. People who are coming from the South and people who might have already been living in the North but who end up all congregating into a similar neighborhood with one another. And it becomes known as the nightclub capital of the world because, again, this is where jazz starts to really take a lot of heavy roots. And this is also right in the middle of the Prohibition era, too, right? The 18th Amendment has already passed by this point, and now booze is illegal. Okay, so you have these speakeasies that happen, pop up in different places here, where, you can go into a regular nightclub and they, on the surface, they might not serve alcohol, but if you go over to a side door or somewhere behind the bar, there might be a passageway that will actually get you into the real nightclub where they're actually serving whiskey or moonshine or whatever the case may be, right? Some kind of alcohol is served behind closed doors. And you get really important individuals who emerge from all this. Alan Locke is the one who actually coins the term the New Negro, and this actual movement, the Harlem Renaissance, is sometimes also known as the New Negro Movement, because this is really, again, this is that generation that has been born not just post-Reconstruction, but in some cases right during Jim Crow, and is actually one of the first generations to move past Jim Crow, to see Jim Crow come to an end. And so Alan Locke is the one who comes up with this term, and he says that the new Negro in the United States is no longer subservient to white culture. Okay, and being able to live in a neighborhood like Harlem in New York City, there's such a pluralistic atmosphere in terms of culture. I mean, even today, New York City, I think, is the most linguistically diverse city anywhere in the world. There's over 800 different languages spoken there. So it's very difficult for one particular ethnic group to try to come along and suppress another one, is the main point. So the other thing about Alan Locke, too, is he's the first black Rhodes Scholar in the United States. And the Rhodes Scholarship is extremely prestigious. This is a postgraduate scholarship that's given to students so that they can study at Oxford University free of charge. Okay, and as someone who has been a postgraduate student myself, getting any kind of funding for postgraduate studies is extremely difficult. Okay, you have to do very, very, very well for yourself in order to do this. So for this to happen for this man is extremely profound, not only for that reason by itself, but also, again, for the reason that he is a black man who is able to secure this kind of funding. Okay, so again, massive leap forward in that regard. Quite possibly the most famous of the literary giants who come from the Harlem Renaissance is Langston Hughes. Okay, he is a poet who publishes so many different narratives about life in America as a black man, having this kind of experience, dealing with society, dealing with all of the hardships that occur. And Langston Hughes is also very unique in the fact that he was actually a gay man as well. Okay, so having that added sense of, I guess, I don't want to call it minority, but that extra sense of marginalization is what I'm trying to get at in society. Okay, during a time period when it was technically illegal to be a homosexual in the United States. Okay, that law didn't even get overturned until I think 1968. Okay, so again, being a black man and being a gay black man on top of it makes it that much more difficult. And the fact that he is so highly celebrated indicates the kind of influence that he has in this entire atmosphere. And Zora Neale Hurston is another one. Okay, Zora Neale Hurston called herself the Queen of the Harlem Renaissance because most of her stories specifically talk about the working class black community and what contributions they end up having on African American culture. Okay, so a lot of her stories typically deal with struggling black families, usually with a very strong female black family leader, right? A mother figure, a matriarch of some kind who helps kind of pull the family together. It's kind of the glue that holds everything together. Okay, so again, a lot of aspects of black culture in the United States that just didn't get a whole lot of attention during the time. Okay, most of the literature that was published during the time period was extremely whitewashed, and people tended to have a very whitewashed view of what life in the United States was like. And so with the Harlem Renaissance, we start to see an actual realization of the reality of life in America as a black man, as a black woman, with all kinds of different variations involved. And another potentially controversial movement during this time period as well is the beginning of what is now known as the Black Power movement, but at the same time was known as Negro nationalism. Begins kind of along the time when a man named James Weldon Johnson, an intellectual of the time, coins the term Afro-American, right, to basically unify black heritage under one generic term. Okay, and the study of post-colonial literature and the post-colonial movement in general is something that is a lot of times applied to black culture more so than anything, especially as it relates to American imperialism, because America had been involved so much in suppressing black culture and suppressing specifically African culture, especially during slavery, that it's kind of the real beginnings of America's attempts at imperialism, right, to suppress a culture that it is trying to at the same time absorb into itself somehow. And so there's all kinds of different approaches to this particular type of topic, especially as it relates to post-colonialism in general. And the Negro nationalist movement is something that comes along with that. Okay? And Negro nationalism is this idea of trying to separate one's life away from mainstream American life. In other words, to focus more on traditional black culture as it relates to whatever original nationality one's family comes from. And again, with slavery and with the limited number of records and so forth that go along with this, with the limited amount of information that can be garnered, it becomes very difficult, really, to specify one particular culture, one particular perhaps tribe, whatever it happens to be, in this larger movement. Okay, so some individuals might have come from the Caribbean, some might have come from West Africa, some might have come from the Congo, might have come from all kinds of different areas. And so Negro nationalism becomes something of a Pan-African, Pan-Caribbean movement in all this, right? Kind of an all-encompassing thing. And the man at the center of it all is Marcus Garvey, who you see here, and who you see also here in the background, wearing this really stupendous military outfit with the plumes in his hat. And Marcus Garvey is an extremely controversial individual because he stylizes himself as the, quote, provisional president of Africa, even though he really didn't have any kind of authority to do this. Okay, Marcus Garvey was considered to be a pretty dangerous individual, even by black intellectuals at the time. In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois refers to him as potentially the most, I think he says, he's the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race, either a lunatic or a traitor. Again, because he has no political authority of any kind, really, to do anything like this, nor any kind of social authority, necessarily, either. As I recall, Marcus Garvey, I believe, comes from Jamaica, and believed that he could somehow pull a bunch of funding from different charitable organizations and different donations from people all over the country to basically repatriate a large portion of the black population from America back to Africa. Okay, and again, that's where this idea of a back to Africa movement starts to enter into American dialogue somewhere along the way. And again, a lot of it is rooted in the ideas of black solidarity, of the black community rallying together, as a single unit, and to promote the empowerment of the black community as well. And this is where we get the term Black Power. Okay, eventually it morphs into a much more militaristic, potentially violent type of thing, especially once we get into the 1970s with the Black Panther movement and so forth. But at this point in time, it doesn't have any kind of necessarily extremist overtones necessarily. But Marcus Garvey also is involved with the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Okay, this is kind of a rival program to what you would see with the NAACP, except rather than trying to promote civil rights for African Americans within American society, it does more to try to separate the black community away from mainstream society and turn it into something else. And eventually into the middle and the later portion of the 1920s, Marcus Garvey actually is, I think he's actually found guilty of running what is essentially a Ponzi scheme of some kind, where he has been funneling money that these people have been donating to him into his own pocket, and to try to basically say he's going to put together some kind of a ship to take people back to Africa. And in one or two cases, this actually does follow through. He actually does manage to take a lot of American citizens, black Americans, back to Africa. But most of it is basically to line his own pockets, is what it amounts to. And Calvin Coolidge, once he becomes president, actually comes in and ends up deporting Garvey back to Jamaica, as far as I'm aware. And I think that's where he lives out the rest of his life. So this is a kind of a short-lived movement and something that is kind of centered more around a cult of personality in the character of Marcus Garvey than anybody else. But it does end up, it sets a precedent, though, again, and you start to see more of a support for this type of movement, again, once we get into the 60s and 70s, once the civil rights movement branches off, and we start to see Black Power kind of make a reemergence again. The most famous scientist of the 20th century, of course, and one that everybody immediately recognizes when they see his face, is Albert Einstein. And Einstein becomes extremely popular during the 1920s in America because he is the first one to really put forth a lot of ideas that have, again, end up challenging the scientific community more than anything else, particularly in the realm of physics. Okay? And he was already famous by the dawn of the 20th century in 1905 because several of his physics papers ended up setting new precedents for how science should be conducted, and eventually some of his theories end up being used toward the ideas of splitting the atom and the creation of the atomic bomb over time. So, in a sense, some very literal blowback in this regard. But again, a lot of his theories set forth brand new precedents. The first paper that he publishes in 1905, for instance, says that light itself is actually made up of tiny little particles called photons. Okay, whereas before the scientific community thought that light was a single gigantic wave of energy that was a single unit. Okay, and so this idea of looking at something that is a larger whole as something that's actually made up of several millions of tiny little particles ends up, again, influencing just about everything else that comes after it. Right? Basically saying that the atom, up until this point, people thought the atom was the smallest thing. Okay? And the image of the atom is this little whirligig symbol here that you see up at the top right, the universally recognized symbol for the atom. But Einstein eventually over time says, no, you can really split the atom down into smaller components. And again, this is what gets taught in most science classes even today. But the whole idea about photons and so forth ends up leading the charge into the field of study of quantum physics, which is still, if you, the saying goes among scientists that if you claim you understand quantum theory, you really do not understand quantum theory. It's incredibly complicated, has to deal with going down into the tiniest fractions of anything existing, right? Something popping in and out of existence randomly, and a lot of people point to this as being kind of the general makeup of the universe over time. But there's so many complicated aspects to it that it's very, very difficult to wrap your head around it. But also what it does is it leads the way into the development of technology that gets used in television sets, into lasers, into semiconductors, into all kinds of new technology that eventually gets used in the Second World War, like the atomic bomb, unfortunately, and well into the later part of the 20th century and stuff that we still use even today. And Einstein actually wins a Nobel Prize for writing this, right? It takes a long time. It takes until 1921 for this to happen, but this particular theory is what kind of launches him into international stardom. The second paper is what ends up talking specifically about atoms and about molecules themselves, right? Basically saying that you can make the atom into smaller components, right? The protons, electrons, neutrons, and all that kind of stuff, if you remember your science classes. And the third paper, and the one that makes him really, really recognizable, is when he introduces the theory of relativity. Okay, and relativity is another thing that is can be a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around. You have to have a very visual image of it in your head in order to kind of wrap your head around it. But basically, what it says is that all of the fundamental concepts that we have of space, time, matter, energy, and everything are in such a state of flux that they are constantly changing and influencing one another. Okay, so when we think about things like the speed of light and how fast it travels, the way, for instance, that if you want to think about time zones, for example, okay, the fact that the curvature of the Earth influences how the sun ends up landing in certain parts of the country at different hours of the day, okay, or if you are in New York City, right, the sun will rise, and then several hours later, then it will rise in Los Angeles, okay, so that's one particular example of relativity, okay, and especially this ends up leading into things like space travel. Once we start actually sending rockets to the moon and space travelers and NASA and all that kind of stuff, it becomes much more advanced, and we still are trying to understand a lot of it even today. Okay, scientists are still trying to figure out how we can end up bending light, bending matter, and so forth to allow for extended space travel, right? Is it something that is actually possible? Can we, in fact, travel faster than the speed of light? Most scientists will tell you no, right? Because it's still a scientific impossibility at this point. But this is getting into a whole other area of study that I'm not 100% familiar with, but I am familiar with just the basics of it. So, and also the fact that gravity plays a large part of this as well. Okay, it ends up distorting space. It distorts time as well. So when we think about the planets revolving around the sun, the moon revolving around the Earth at different speeds and so forth, all of this ends up changing things, right? Even something down to as simple as how the moon's proximity toward the Earth affects its tides and so forth, right? All of these things are relative to one another depending on where they fall in the universe. So, it's extremely complicated. Nothing you need to really be able to understand in order to appreciate Einstein, but if this is a field of study you're interested in getting into, there's a lot to unfold, a lot of layers to peel off. But the thing that leads him to develop what people end up considering atomic theory is the idea that if you disrupt the atomic structure itself, if you do split the atom in a very small way, it can result in an enormous energy explosion, is basically what it amounts to. So splitting the atom becomes very difficult and very complicated and very dangerous. So if you do manage to do it, right, it will end up with an enormous amount of energy being expelled. Okay, atoms are almost like little small grenades. That's why we call it an atomic bomb. Okay, because the atoms themselves end up exploding. And again, this type of thing is something that scientists have never thought of before. Right? They've never considered the fact that these natural laws that we've been in recognition of since the Enlightenment era could be even more complicated than what they originally imagined. Okay? And again, we still don't know what we don't know in many cases when it comes to science, when it comes to life outside of Earth, on other planets, other galaxies. I mean, it's endless. Okay, so this is just one small drop in the ocean, as it were. And the term relative becomes something that is very commonplace and very oversimplified when it refers to popular culture and so forth, and saying that there is not really a set of absolute standards. And that is not necessarily what Einstein was getting at, but it does have its applications. Right? The idea of the word normal, for example. Right? If you use the word normal, normal is relative. Okay, so one person's standards are not another person's standards. Sense of style, sense of beliefs, ethics, etc. Right? It's all relative, is the popular term. So that's kind of where the term ends up originating. But again, slightly different than what we originally intend for it to be. And like I said before, art itself becomes something that people begin to call decadent because it's not necessarily figurative, it's not necessarily representative or realistic looking anymore. It's very distorted, it's very warped, and modernist art is what it is essentially referred to as, is basically this idea to break away from tradition and to try to violate whatever norms, again, whatever relative norms that we had before, and in some cases is meant to shock people, okay, to draw something potentially vulgar or to try to disturb people, to give them something that they don't expect and which might actually intimidate them somehow. And there's three unsettling assumptions that go along with the movement of modernism in general, and it's not always necessarily art. Just about any cultural and artistic movement during the early part of the 20th century tends to span all areas of creativity. So art, literature, architecture, music, right? All these types of areas all kind of have the same thing, and modernism is one of those things. Okay, so modernism has three different unsettling assumptions that kind of shake society to its core. The first one, and potentially the most jarring, is the idea that God does not exist. Okay, and again, this is in part because of the culture and the generation in particular that espouses this idea as the one that has just come back from war. Okay. Most of the younger generation who have fought in the war have been extremely traumatized by it, and they find it very difficult now to go back to these traditional ways of viewing God and religion and ethics and morality and so forth. Again, in some cases, just saying it's all relative. And it's saying that if God does not exist, if he can allow these types of things to happen, or it, or he or she, or however you view deity or spirituality, whatever, in whatever way, then this is how the world actually is. This is how the modern mind views the world and views society, and it tends to be extremely cynical. Okay. The second one, again, is that the idea of reality is not something that's rational, it's not something that's orderly, and not always something that's obvious either. And this gets into very philosophical territory. One of the most mind-numbing questions that I think I ever encountered in a philosophy class was the question of, what do you think the world looks like outside your head? Okay, and it's mind-numbing, very mind-bending consideration, because the question then is, does everybody view the world, colors and shapes and words and all that kind of stuff, do they all view it exactly the same? Okay, so are the colors you're perceiving the exact same thing as the colors of the person standing next to you? Okay, that sort of thing. So saying that reality is not something that is that everybody can perceive in the exact same way, and that it doesn't always make sense. Okay, and part of that goes a little bit more along with evolutionary theory, that evolution is seemingly random, right, and it doesn't really follow any kind of moral compulsion or moral dictate of any kind, right? It doesn't follow the whim of a divinity of any sort. And again, it's not always orderly either, right? It doesn't seem like anything necessarily happens always at the most opportune time, okay? In other words, there's not always going to be that deus ex machina moment where you have, someone coming in to rescue you at the last minute in the midst of disaster. And the First World War was exactly some evidence of that. Okay, you had so many soldiers who were dying very, very horrible and gruesome deaths, and dying in many cases in desperation. And so for those who survived to encounter all this and then to come home and to try to go back to the way things were and to have an optimistic outlook on the world becomes very difficult. Okay, so these two things are, again, very difficult to swallow. And the third one is the idea that social progress in general is not something that can be taken for granted anymore. In other words, there's no guarantee that society is going to progress in a positive way. Okay. And again, the First World War is a prime example of that, right? It shatters all expectations of what the future can hold for people, right? An entire generation, for the most part, has been wiped out by this war. Okay. It has forever changed the map of the world. It has changed society. It has changed how the nations of the world view each other, how they view themselves. And so basically it says that the future is uncertain and there's no way of knowing for sure that everything is going to be okay. All right. So again, it's a potentially cynical way of looking at things, but this becomes one of the key features of modernism. And when you see those things applied to modern art, sometimes it makes modern art make a little bit more sense. One of the key events that deals specifically with modern art in general is an event that happens in 1913 called the Armory Show. And it's considered the most scandalous event in the history of American art because this is the first full-fledged modern art exhibition in the United States. And it's something that ends up garnering a lot of attention, potentially for the fact that it ends up offending a lot of people, because this type of art that people are suddenly bringing into all this is stuff that they have been suppressing for a long time, right? If you want to bring Freud into it, right? Some of it is overtly sexual, some of it is simply dark, some of it is cynical, some of it is grotesque, right? And so and there are still obscenity laws that exist in the United States at this point, right? The First Amendment only goes so far. So, and a lot of those types of laws eventually get shot down when we get into the 1960s and 70s. But this is still a time period when these types of art are not going to be considered acceptable by a lot of people. And so the Armory Show ends up with 1,200 different modernist pieces of art collected from over 300 painters, sculptors, and so forth. So you see a lot of the potentially grotesque images like what you see up here on the top right? What appears to be 2 or perhaps even 3 human bodies kind of melting into one another. You see what appear to be sexual organs on display. You see all the folds in the human body and so forth. And so these types of things weren't something that people were typically recognizing very readily, or at least that they weren't ready to recognize. And so you get a lot of different very famous artists whose work gets put on display here. Okay, even individuals who had long since passed. So individuals like Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Henri Matisse, Paul Cézanne, and Pablo Picasso all become extremely popular. Okay, and again, all of these individuals have had works of art that have been on display in some respects in Europe and so forth for several years, but once they come to the United States, again, Europe and the United States have kind of a break in terms of their expectations for things. And again, Europe kind of understands this more cynical modernist view of things because Europe has been completely annihilated by the First World War, and America is still riding high in terms of economic prosperity. So some parts of American society who are still doing well, monetarily speaking, don't really understand this viewpoint. Okay, they don't understand or accept the fact that things are going to be horrible or potentially horrible in the future. And again, this is still before the Great Depression has occurred, so cynicism hasn't quite seeped in to everybody's mindset just yet. And in 1929, the New York Museum of Modern Art is finally established, and this becomes the world's most celebrated collection of modernist art of this particular type. Okay, so again, you have paintings, you have sculptures, you have all kinds of things that are collected together and become just a general just a general collection of this type of mindset, right? This idea that things may not always be okay, but we can still express ourselves and what we're feeling, what we have experienced or are currently experiencing, and present them to the American public. And again, with modernism coming into the forefront of America's mindset, and especially with this group of people who have survived the First World War, there's a ton of cynicism that gets involved with this, and a sense of futility in some cases. And even if you watch interviews with, interviews from the past, obviously, of World War I veterans, many of them who were even over the age of 100 will even say in interviews that they felt that this was kind of a pointless war, right? That they really didn't feel any sense of fulfillment in serving their country or doing anything like that, right? It felt like it was an exercise in futility. And so when it comes to the literature aspect of modernism, okay, you have individuals like Ezra Pound. Okay, Ezra Pound was an American poet who became an expatriate. Okay, he becomes kind of the primary voice of modernism and expressing this cynicism through poetry. He ends up leaving the United States, and I believe he goes and lives in France for most of his life, and kind of expressing himself. He's a very eclectic individual, kind of eccentric in his appearance, and kind of lived I won't call it a frivolous life. That's not quite what I'm getting at, but a flamboyant lifestyle. Okay. T.S. Eliot is another very famous one. He and Ezra Pound were very close with one another. He becomes Pound's protege over time and considered his successor as the leading modernist poet for America, who also becomes an expatriate. Okay, T.S. Eliot very famously writes a very, very long poem about the experience of modernism after the war and so forth, and about all the horrors of living in society and trying to, deal with whether or not you should move on with progressive ideas or whether you should go back to traditionalism. You're being torn in several different directions, and just feeling lost in general. Okay. And his poem, "The Wasteland," is the name of the poem I'm trying to think of. It's 433 lines long, right? And again, it's mind-numbing because there's so much information, but once you do actually begin to read it, try to understand it, all of the confusion and the chaos of life ends up kind of flooding in all at once, and it's kind of overwhelming to read. Gertrude Stein is another very famous individual from the time period. She is also unique in the fact that she is another expatriate as well, but also that she was lesbian. Okay, and again, during a time period when this was, again, considered to be illegal in the United States, right? She becomes one of the individuals who leaves the country again, goes and lives in Paris, and becomes a novelist, okay? And she's the one who coins the term lost generation. Okay, and the lost generation is the term given to individuals who served in World War I and who somewhere along the line, whether through the trauma of it or just simply trying to come back and reintegrate themselves into society, they've somewhere along the line lost their sense of self-identity. Okay, so they don't know how to define themselves anymore. Okay, are they young people? Are they Americans? Are they conservatives? Are they progressives? Are they, what are they? Right? And how should they view the world going forward now that they've experienced all this? And Ernest Hemingway is potentially one of the most famous individuals to come from this particular movement. And he is classified by Gertrude Stein as one of the primary lost generation authors. Okay? And Hemingway's his themes in all of his stories tend to recount the horrors of war. Okay, most of his novels end with very violent deaths in many cases, and tend to encounter some sort of loss of innocence in the course of whatever story it happens to be. So an individual losing a loved one, or being involved in a very sticky situation, or being involved in something that society doesn't always talk about. Okay, so he's willing to talk about the difficult subjects. Very famous story of his is called The Pearl, where a young child is actually killed involved, and it's a very bloody affair. You have stories of his where there are animal attacks that occur, where people are ripped to shreds in very grotesque ways, and the human condition and everything kind of gets involved in a lot of that. And Hemingway himself actually meets with a rather bitter end. He actually ends up committing suicide later in life. So, all of these, all of the authors and the poets and stuff from this time period and from this lost generation tend to engage in a lot of self-destructive behavior. Okay, and those who live into the 50s and 60s, like Pound and Eliot and Hemingway, all end up engaging in, alcoholism, drug abuse, risky sexual lifestyles, and so forth. So, this is kind of the first wave, potentially, of what could be considered a counterculture movement. And again, we're still very far away from the 50s and 60s and the actual full formation of those types of things, but this is the first pushback against the status quo in America. And again, most of the characters that Hemingway writes about tend to follow this pattern. They're self-indulgent, they're self-destructive, they drink themselves to death, they get themselves killed in reckless ways. So he writes books like The Sun Also Rises. And even F. Scott Fitzgerald's book, The Great Gatsby, becomes a story that basically represents the way that the mindset of the 1920s is among this younger generation. Okay, cynicism, aimlessness, and self-indulgence, really. Just, getting what you can while you can, because we're all going to die anyway. Okay, so again, it's not a very optimistic outlook by this new generation. This is, again, just a time period when people try to engage in these kinds of behaviors, especially in the younger generation, because they don't know what the future holds for them, right? Again, there is no guarantee that we are not going to go to war again, and as many of them will see, yes, we actually do end up engaging in another war in less than 20 years. So it's they're in some ways they're right, and in other ways they're severely misguided. But it's a fine line in some cases.